Hello, everybody. So nice to be with you again tonight. We are still in Prince Caspian, but this is our last session of Prince Caspian. I'm going to read chapters 13, 14, and 15 tonight. And as you might remember, the last time we were together, we discovered that Aslan had met the children one by one. They didn't all see him at once, did they? He had scolded Susan just a little tiny bit because she had just refused to believe, even though she, in her heart of hearts, knew Lucy was telling the truth, that she had seen Aslan. Susan was just feeling sulky, and she just didn't want to admit that she was right. And now they have finally made their way down the ravine and up the other side and come up to where King Caspian is in the How, Aslan's How, and they have met him. And now the wicked enemies that Nickelbrick was going to call in to help have been dealt with. And we're going to see what happens next when the High King is in command. Chapter 13. Now, said Peter, as they finished their meal, Aslan and the girls, that's Queen Susan and Queen Lucy, Caspian, are somewhere close. We don't know when he will act, but in the meantime, no doubt, not ours. Sorry, let's start that again. In his time, no doubt, not ours, but in the meantime, he would like us to do what we can on our own. You say, Caspian, that we are not strong enough to meet Miraz in a pitched battle? I am afraid not, High King, said Caspian. He was liking Peter very much, but was rather tongue-tied. It was much stranger for him to meet the great kings out of the old stories than it was for them to meet him. Very well, then, said Peter. I'll send him a challenge to single combat. Nobody had thought of that before. Please, said Caspian, couldn't it be me? I want to avenge my father. You are wounded, said Peter. And anyway, wouldn't he just laugh at a challenge from you? I mean, we have seen that you are a king and a warrior, but he thinks of you as just a kid. But sire, said the badger, who sat very close to Peter and had never taken his eyes off him, will he accept a challenge even from you? He knows he has the stronger army. Very likely he won't, said Peter, but there's always the chance. And even if he doesn't, we shall have spent the best part of the day sending heralds back and forth, and by that time Aslan may have done something, and at least I can inspect the army and strengthen our position. I'll send the challenge. In fact, I'll write it at once. Do you have pen and ink, Master Doctor? A scholar is never without them, said Dr. Cornelius. Very well, I will dictate, said Peter. And while the doctor spread out a parchment and opened his ink bottle and sharpened his pen, Peter leaned back with half-closed eyes and recalled to mind the language of old Narnia, in which he had written such a thing long ago in Narnia's golden age. Right, he said at last. And now, if you're ready, Doctor. Dr. Cornelius dipped his pen in the ink and waited. Peter dictated as follows. Peter, by the gift of Aslan, by election, by prescription, and by conquest, High King over all kings in Narnia, Emperor of the Lone Islands, Lord of Caird Paravel, Knight of the most noble army of the Lion, to Miraz, son of Caspian the Eighth, sometime Lord Protector of Narnia, and now styling himself as King of Narnia, greetings. Have you got that? Narnia, common, greetings, muttered the doctor to himself. Yes, sire. Then begin a new paragraph, said Peter. For to prevent the effusion of blood, and for avoiding all other inconveniences likely to grow from the wars now levied in our realm of Narnia, it is our pleasure to adventure our royal person on behalf of our trusty and well-beloved Caspian, in clean wager of battle to prove upon your lordship's body that the said Caspian is the lawful king under us in Narnia, both by our gift and by the law of the Telmarines. And your lordship twice guilty of treachery, both in withholding the dominion of Narnia from the said Caspian, and the most abominable and bloody and unnatural murder of your kindly lord and brother, King Caspian the Ninth. Wherefore, we most heartily provoke, challenge, and defy your lordship to the said combat, and have sent these letters by the hand of our well-beloved and royal brother Edmund, sometime king under Narnia, Duke of Lantern Waste, Count of the Western March, Knight of the Noble Order of the Table, to whom we have given full power of determining with your lordship all the conditions of the said battle, given at our lodging in Aslan's How, this 12th day of the month Green Roof, in the first year of Caspian the 10th of Narnia. That ought to do, said Peter, drawing a deep breath. And now we must send 2 others with King Edmund, and I think the giant ought to be one. He's not very clever, you know, said King Caspian. Of course not, said Peter, but any giant looks impressive if only he'll keep quiet. And it might cheer him up. But what about the other? Upon my word, said Trumpkin, if you want someone who could kill with looks, Reepicheep would be the best. He would indeed, from all I hear, said Peter with a laugh, if only he wasn't so small. They wouldn't even see him until he got so close. Send Glenstorm, sire, said Truffle Hunter. No one ever laughed at a centaur. An hour later, 2 great lords in the army of Miraz, King Glozell and the Lord Sopespian, were strolling along their lines and picking their teeth after breakfast. They looked up and saw coming down to them from the wood the centaur and giant Wimbleweather, and someone whom they had both seen in battle, but between them a figure whom they did not recognize. Nor indeed would the other boys at Edmund's school have recognized him if they had seen him at that moment, for Aslan had breathed upon him when they had met, and a kind of greatness hung about him. Now what, said Lord Glozell, an attack? A parley rather, said Sopespian. See, they carry green branches. They're coming to surrender, most likely. He that is walking between the centaur and the giant has no look of surrender on his face, said Glozell. Who can he be? It's not the boy Caspian. No, indeed, said Sopespian. This is a full warrior, I warrant you, wherever the rebels got him from. He is, in your lordship's private ear, a kinglier man than Miraz ever was. And what chain mail he wears! None of our smiths can make anything like that. I'll wager my dappled horse he brings a challenge and not a surrender, said Glozell. Well, what then, said Sopespian. We hold the enemy in our fist here. Miraz would never be so half-brained as to throw away his advantage on a single combat. But he might be brought to it, said Glozell in a much lower voice. Softly, said Sopespian. Step a little aside here, out of the earshot of those sentries. Now, do I take your lord's meaning aright? If the king undertook a wager of battle, whispered Glozell, why, he would either kill or be killed. So, said Sopespian, nodding his head, and if he killed, we should have won this war. Certainly. And if not? Why, if not, well, we should be able to win it without the king as with him, for you know that the Lord Miraz is no great captain. And after that, we would be both victorious and kingless. And is it your meaning, my lord, that you and I could hold this land quite as conveniently without a king as with one? Glozell's voice grew ugly. I'm not forgetting, he said, that it was we who put him on the throne in the first place. And in all the years that he has enjoyed that, what fruits have come our way? What gratitude has he shown us? Say no more, said Sopespian. But look, here comes someone to fetch us to the king's tent. When they reached Miraz's tent, they saw Edmund and his 2 companions seated outside it, being entertained with cakes and wine, having already delivered the challenge, and they had withdrawn while the king was considering it. When they saw them at close quarters, the 2 Telmarine lords thought that all 3 of them were very alarming. Inside, they found Miraz, unarmed and finishing his breakfast. His face was flushed and there was a scowl on his forehead. There, he growled, flinging the parchment across the table to them. See what a pack of nursery tales our jackasses of a nephew has sent us. By your leave, sire, said Glozell, if the young warrior whom we have seen outside is the King Edmund mentioned in this writing, then I would not call him a nursery tale, but a very dangerous knight. King Edmund, pah, said Miraz. Does your lordship believe those old wives' tales about Peter and Edmund and the rest? I believe my eyes, your majesty, said Glozell. Well, this is no good, said Miraz, but as about the challenge, I suppose there is only one opinion among us. I suppose so, I suppose so indeed, said Glozell. And what is that? Said the king. Almost infallibly to refuse it, said Glozell. For though I have never been called a coward, I must say that if I had to meet a young man in battle, that would be more than my heart would serve me for. And, as is likely, his brother, the High King, is more dangerous than he. Why then, on your life, my lord, have nothing to do with them. A plague on you, said Miraz. That was not the kind of counsel I wanted. Do you think I'm asking you if I should be afraid to meet this Peter, if there is such a man? Do you think I'm afraid of him? I wanted your counsel on the policy of the matter, whether we, having the advantage, should hazard it on a wager of battle. To which I can only reply, your majesty, said Glozell, that for all the reasons the challenge should be refused. There is death in that strange knight's face. There you go again, said Miraz, now thoroughly angry. Are you trying to make it appear that I'm as big a coward as your lordship? Your majesty can say whatever you like, said Glozell sulkily. You talk like an old woman, Glozell, said Miraz. What do you say, Lord Caspian? Don't touch it, sire, said the reply. And what your majesty says of the policy of the thing comes in very happily. It gives your majesty an excellent reason to refuse without any way to question your majesty's honor or courage. Great heavens, said Miraz, jumping to his feet. Are you all bewitched today? Do you think I'm looking for reasons to refuse it? You may as well call me a coward to my face. The conversation was going exactly as the two lords wished, so they said nothing. I see what it is, said Miraz, after staring at them as if his eyes would pop out of his head. You are as lily-livered as rabbits yourselves, and you have the effrontery to imagine my heart is the same as yours. Grounds for refusal indeed, excuses for not fighting. Are you soldiers? Are you telmarines? Are you men? And if I do refuse it, as common policy would urge me to do, you will think and teach others to think that I was afraid. Isn't that so? No man of your majesty's age, said Glozell, would be called a coward by any wise soldier for refusing combat with a great warrior in the flower of his youth. So I'm now an old man with a foot in the grave as well as a coward, roared Miraz. I'll tell you what it is, my lords. With your womanish counsels, ever straying from the true point, which is one of policy, you have done the very opposite of your intent. I had meant to refuse it, but I will accept it. Do you hear? I will accept it. I'll not be shamed because some witchcraft or treason has frozen your blood. We beseech your majesty, said Glozell, but Miraz had flung out of the tent, and they could hear him bawling out his acceptance to King Edmund. The two lords looked at one another and chuckled quietly. I knew he'd do it if he were properly chafed, said Glozell, but I'll not forget him calling me a coward. He'll pay for that. There was a great stirring in Aslan's howl when the news came back and was communicated to the various creatures. Edmund, with one of Miraz's captains, had already marked out the place for the combat, and ropes and stakes had been put around it. 2 telmarines were to stand at 2 of the corners, and 1 in the middle of one side, as marshal of the lists. The lists was the place where the combat was going to take place, and it was sort of a long rectangular shape with ropes all the way around it. Marshals or referees, you might say, at each end, making sure that everybody fought fairly, and then one in the middle too, because the long side was much longer than the short side was. Got that picture in your mind? Okay, so let me see here. Ropes and stakes had been put around it. 2 telmarines were to stand at 2 of the corners and 1 in the middle of one side as marshals of the lists. 3 marshals for the other 2 corners and the other side were to be furnished by the High King. Peter was just explaining to Caspian that he could not be one because his right to the throne was what they were fighting for, when suddenly a thick, sleepy voice said, "Your Majesty, please." Peter turned, and there stood the eldest of the bulgy bears. "If you please, Your Majesty, I'm a bear, I am." "To be sure you are, and a good bear too, I've no doubt," said Peter. "Yes," said the bear, "but it was always the right of the bears to supply one of the marshals of the lists." "Don't let him," whispered Trumpkin to Peter. "He's a good creature, but he'll shame us all. He'll fall asleep, and he will suck his paws in front of the enemy, too." "I can't help that," said Peter, "because he's quite right. The bears have had that privilege. I can't imagine how that has been remembered in all these years when so many other things have been forgotten." "Please, Your Majesty," said the bear. "It is your right," said Peter, "and you shall be one of the marshals, but you must remember not to suck your paws." "Of course not," said the bear in a very shocked voice. "But you're doing it right this minute," bellowed Trumpkin. Here's the bear sucking his paws, and Trumpkin is yelling at him. The bear whipped his paw out of his mouth and pretended he hadn't heard. "Sire," came a shrill little voice from near the ground. "Ah, Reepicheep," said Peter, after looking up and down and round as people usually did when being addressed by the mouse. "Sire," said Reepicheep, "my life is ever at your command, but my honor is its own. Sire, I have among my people the only trumpeter in your Majesty's army. I thought I might have been sent with the challenge. Sire, my people are grieved. Perhaps if it were your pleasure that I could be a marshal of the lists, it would content them." A noise not unlike thunder broke out from somewhere overhead at this point, as Giant Wimbleweather burst into one of those not very intelligent laughs to which the nicer sorts of giants are so liable. He checked himself at once and looked grave as a turnip by the time Reepicheep discovered where the noise was coming from. "I'm afraid it would not do," said Peter. "Some humans are afraid of mice." "I have observed that, sire," said Reepicheep. "And it wouldn't really be fair to Miraz," Peter continued, "to have anything in sight that might take the edge off his courage." "Your Majesty is the mirror of honor," said the mouse with one of his admirable bows, "and on this matter we have but a single mind. And I thought I heard someone laughing just now. If anyone present wishes to make me the subject of his wit, I am very much at his service with my sword and at his leisure." An awful silence followed this remark, which was broken by Peter saying, "Giant Wimbleweather and the bear and the centaur Glenstorm shall be our marshals. The combat will be at 2 hours after noon, and dinner at noon precisely." "I say," said Edmund as they walked away, "I suppose it is all right. I suppose you can beat him." "That's what I'm fighting him to find out," said Peter. Chapter 14. How all were very busy. A little before 2 o'clock, Trumpkin and the badger sat with the rest of the creatures at the wood's edge, looking across at the gleaming line of Miraz's army, which was about 2 arrow shots away. In between, a square space of level grass had been staked for the combat. At the 2 far corners stood Glozell and Caspian with drawn swords. At the near corners were Giant Wimbleweather and the bulgy bear, who, in spite of all their warnings, was sucking his paws and looking, to tell the truth, uncommonly silly. To make up for this, Glenstorm, on the right side of the lists, stood stock still, except for he stomped his hind foot occasionally and looked much more imposing than the Telmarine Baron who faced him on the left. Peter had just shaken hands with Edmund and the doctor and was now walking down to the combat. It was like the moment before a pistol goes off in an important race, but very much worse. "I wish Aslan had turned up before it came to this," said Trumpkin. "So do I," said Trufflehunter, "but look behind you." "Crows and crockery," muttered the dwarf as soon as he had done so. "What are they?" "Huge people, beautiful people like gods and goddesses and giants, hundreds and thousands of them, closing behind us. What are they?" "It's the Dryads and the Hamadryads and the Sylvans," said Trufflehunter. "Aslan has waked them." Said the dwarf. "That'll be very useful if the enemy tries any treachery, but it won't help the king much if Miraz proves to be handier with his sword." The badger said nothing, for now Peter and Miraz were entering the lists from the opposite end, both on foot, both in chainmail shirts, with helmets and shields. They advanced until they were close together. Both bowed and seemed to speak, but it was impossible to hear what they said. The next moment, the two swords flashed in the sunlight. For a second, the clash could be heard, but it was immediately drowned out because both armies began shouting like crowds at a football match. "Well done, Peter, oh, well done," shouted Edmund as he saw Miraz reel back a whole pace and a half. "Follow up quick." And Peter did, and for a few seconds it looked as if the fight might be won. Here we are. There's a picture of Peter and Miraz in the lists and the marshals around the edge and the armies standing behind that. But Miraz pulled himself together and began to make good use of his height and weight. "Miraz! Miraz! The king! The king!" came the roar of the Telmarines. Caspian and Edmund grew white with sickening anxiety. "Peter is taking some dreadful knocks," said Edmund. "Hello," said Caspian. "What's happening now?" "Both are falling back," said Edmund. "A bit blown, I expect. Watch. Now they're beginning again, more scientifically this time, circling around and around, feeling each other's defenses." "I'm afraid Miraz knows his work," muttered the doctor. But hardly had he said this, there was much clapping and baying and throwing up of hoods among the old Narnians. It was nearly deafening. "What was that? What was that?" said the doctor. "My old eyes missed it." "The High King has pricked him in the armpit," said Caspian, still clapping, "just where the armhole of the male shirt let the point go through. First blood." "It's looking ugly, though," said Edmund. "Peter is not using his shield properly. He must be hurt in his left arm." It was only too true. Everyone could see that Peter's shield hung limp. The shouting of the Telmarines redoubled. "You've seen more battles than I," said Caspian. "Is there any chance now?" "Precious little," said Edmund. "I suppose he might just do it." "Why did we let this happen at all?" said Caspian. Suddenly, the shouting on both sides died down, and Edmund was puzzled for a moment. And then he said, "Oh, I see. They've both agreed to arrest. Come on, Doctor. You and I may be able to do something for the High King." And they ran down to the lists, and Peter came outside the ropes to meet them, his face red and sweaty and his chest heaving. "Is your left arm wounded?" asked Edmund. "Well, it's not exactly a wound," said Peter. "I got the full weight of his shoulder on my shield like a load of bricks, and the rim of the shield drove into my wrist. I don't think it's broken, but it might be a sprain. If you could tie it up very tight, I think I could manage." And while they were doing this, Edmund asked anxiously, "What do you think of him, Peter?" "Tough," said Peter, "very tough. I have a chance if I can keep him on the hop until his weight and his short wind come against him in this hot sun. Tell the truth, I don't have much else to go on. Give my love to everyone at home, Ed, if he gets me." Here he comes into the lists again. So long, old chap. Goodbye, doctor. And I say, Ed, say something nice to Trumpkin. He's been a brick. Edmund couldn't speak. He walked back with the doctor to his own lines with a sick feeling in his stomach. But the new bout went well. Peter now seemed to be able to make some use of his shield, and he certainly made good use of his feet. He was almost playing tag with Miraz now, keeping out of range, shifting his ground, making the enemy do all the work. Coward! Booed the Telmarines. Why don't you stand up to him? You don't like it, eh? Thought you come to fight, not to dance. Oh, I do hope he won't listen to them, said Caspian. Oh, not he, said Edmund. You don't know him. Oh! For Miraz had gotten a blow in at last on Peter's helmet. Peter staggered, slipped sideways, and fell on one knee. The roar of the Telmarines rose like the noise of the sea. Now, Miraz, now! Kill him quick! But indeed, there was no need to egg him on. He was on top of Peter already. Edmund bit his lips until the blood came as the sword flashed down on Peter, and it looked as if it would slash off his head. Thank heavens, though, it had glanced down on his right shoulder. The dwarf-made chainmail was sound and did not break. Great Scott, said Edmund. He's up again. Peter, go, Peter! I couldn't see what happened, said the doctor. How did he do it? He grabbed Miraz's arm as it came down, said Trumpkin, dancing with delight. There's a man for you. Uses his enemy's arm as a ladder. The High King, up, old Narnia. Look, said Truffle Hunter, Miraz is angry. That's good. They were certainly at it hammer and tongs now, such a flurry of blows that it seemed impossible for either of them not to be killed. As the excitement grew, the shouting almost died away. The spectators were holding their breath. It was a most horrible and most magnificent battle. A great shout arose from the old Narnians. Miraz was down, not struck by Peter, but face down, having tripped on some grass. Peter stepped back, waiting for him to arise. Oh, bother, does he have to be a gentleman like that? I suppose he must. It comes of being a knight and a high king. I suppose that's what what Aslan would like. But that brute will be up again in a minute, and then... But that brute never rose. The Lords Glozell and Caspian had their own plans ready. As soon as they saw that their king was down, they leaped into the lists, crying, Treachery, treachery! The Narnian traitor has stabbed him in the back while he lied helpless. To arms, Telmar! Peter hardly understood what was happening. He saw two big men running toward him with drawn swords. Then the third Telmarine had leaped over the ropes on his left. To arms, Narnia! Treachery! Peter shouted. If all three had set upon him at once, he never would have spoken again, but Glozell stopped to stab his own king dead where he lay. That is for your insult this morning, he whispered as the blade went into his back. Peter swung to face Caspian, slashed his legs from under him, and with the back cut of the same stroke, walloped off his head. Edmund was now at his side, crying, Narnia, Narnia, the lion! The whole Telmarine army was rushing toward them. But now the giant was stamping forward, stooping low and swinging his club. The centaur charged. Twang, twang behind him, and hiss, hiss overhead came the archery of the dwarfs. Trumpkin was fighting at his left. Full battle was joined. Come back, Reepicheep, you little fool, shouted Peter. You'll only get killed. This is no place for mice. But the ridiculous little creature was dancing in and out among the feet of both armies, all of the mice jabbing with their swords. Many a Telmarine warrior that day felt his foot suddenly pierced as if by a dozen skewers, and hopped away on one leg, cursing the pain, and fell down as often as not. And if he fell, the mice finished him off. And if he didn't, someone else did. But almost before the old Narnians were really warming to their work, they found the enemy giving way. Tough-looking warriors turned white, gazing in terror, not at the old Narnians, but on something behind them. and they flung down their weapons and shrieked, "The wood, the wood, the end of the world!" But soon neither their cries nor the sound of the weapons could be heard any more, for both were drowned out in an ocean-like roar of the awakened trees as they plunged down through the ranks of Peter's army and then on in pursuit of the Telmarines. Have you ever stood on the edge of a great wood on a high ridge when a wild southern wind broke over it in full fury on an autumn evening? Imagine that sound, and then imagine that the wood, instead of being fixed to one place, was rushing at you and was no longer trees but people, yet still like trees because their long arms waved like branches and their heads tossed and leaves fell all around them in showers. It was like that for the Telmarines. It was a little alarming even for the Narnians. In a few minutes, all of Miraz's followers were running down to the great river in hopes of crossing the bridge to the town of Baruna, and there defending themselves behind the ramparts and the closed gates. They reached the river, but there was no bridge. That had disappeared since yesterday. Then other panic and horror fell among them, and they surrendered. But what had happened to the bridge? Early that morning, after a few hours' sleep, the girls had waked to see Aslan standing over them and to hear his voice saying, "We will make a holiday." And they rubbed their eyes and looked around them. The trees had all gone, but could still be seen moving toward Aslan's house in a dark mass. Bacchus and the Menaids, his fierce and madcap girls, and Silenus were still there. Lucy, fully rested, jumped up. Everyone was awake. Everyone was laughing, playing the flutes and cymbals. Animals, not talking animals, were crowding in upon them from every direction. "What is it, Aslan?" said Lucy, her eyes dancing and her feet wanting to dance. "Come on, children," he said. "Ride on my back again today." "Ooh, lovely," said Lucy, and both girls climbed onto that warm golden back, as they had done no one knew how many years before. Then the whole party moved off, Aslan leading, Bacchus and his Menaids leaping and rushing and turning and somersaulting, the beasts frisking around them, and Silenus and his donkey bringing up the rear. They turned a little to the right, raced down a steep hill, and found the long bridge of Baruna in front of them. Before they had begun to cross it, however, up out of the water came a great, wet, bearded head, larger than a man's, crowned with rushes. It looked at Aslan, and out of its mouth a deep voice came. "Hail, Lord," it said, "loose my chains." Here's a picture on both pages. You can see the person who's speaking saying, "Loose my chains." And over here are the children and all the Menaids and Bacchus all running down to the water. "What on earth is that?" whispered Susan. "I think it's the river god, but hush," said Lucy. "Bacchus," said Aslan, "deliver him from his chains." "That means the bridge, I suppose," thought Lucy. And so it did. Bacchus and his people splashed forward into the shallow water, and a minute later the most curious thing began to happen. Great, strong trunks of ivy came curling up all the pillars of the bridge, growing as quickly as fire grows. They wrapped around the stones, splitting them, breaking them, separating them. The walls of the bridge turned into hedges, hawthorn, ivy, and then the whole thing disappeared with a rush and crumbled into the swirling water. With much splashing and screaming and laughter, the revelers waded or swam or danced across the ford. "Hooray, it's the ford of Baruna again," the girls said, and up on the banks of the far side and into the town. Everyone in the streets fled before their faces. The first house they came to was a school, a girls' school, where a lot of Narnian girls, with their hair done in very tight braids and ugly tight collars around their necks and thick, scratchy stockings on their legs, were having a history lesson. The sort of history that was taught in Narnia under Miraz was duller than the truest history you've ever read, and less true than the greatest adventure story. "If you don't attend, Gwendolen," said the schoolmistress, "and stop looking out of the window, I shall have to give you a tally mark." "But please, Miss Frizzle," began Gwendolen. "Did you hear what I said, Gwendolen?" asked Miss Frizzle. "But please, Miss Frizzle," said Gwendolen, "there's a lion." "You are having 2 tally marks for talking nonsense," said Miss Frizzle. "And now—" And a roar interrupted her. Ivy came curling in at the windows of the classroom. The walls became a mass of shimmering green, and leafy branches arched overhead where the ceiling has been. Miss Frizzle found that she was standing in a forest glade. She clutched at her desk to steady herself and found that the desk was now a rose bush. Wild people such as she had never imagined were crowding around her. And then she saw the lion and screamed and fled. And with her fled her class, who were mostly dumpy, prim little girls with fat legs. But Gwendolen hesitated. "You'll stay with us, sweetheart," said Aslan. "Oh, may I? Oh, thank you, said Gwendolen. And instantly she joined hands with 2 of the Maenades, who whirled her around in a merry dance and helped her take off some of the unnecessary and uncomfortable clothes she was wearing. Wherever they went in the little town of Beruna, it was the same. Most of the people fled. A few joined them. When they left the town, they were a larger and merrier company. They swept across the level fields on the north bank or left bank of the river, and every farm animal came out to join them. Some old donkeys who had never known joy grew suddenly young again. Chained dogs broke their chains. Horses kicked their carts to pieces and came trotting along after them, clop, clop, kicking up the mud and whinnying. At a well in a yard, they met a man who was beating a boy. The stick burst into flowers in the man's hand. He tried to drop it, but it stuck to his hand, and his arm became a branch, and his body became the trunk of a tree, and his feet took root. Here we are. Here's the man beating the boy who's now turned into a tree. The boy, who had been crying a moment before, burst out laughing and joined them. At the little town halfway to Beaver's Dam, where 2 rivers met, they came to another school, where a tired-looking girl was teaching math to a number of boys who looked very much like pigs. She looked out the window and saw the divine revelers singing in the street, and a stab of joy went through her heart. Aslan stopped right under the window and looked up at her. "Oh, don't. I'd love to, but I mustn't. I must stick to my words, and I have to teach the children, and they would be frightened if they saw you." "Frightened?" said the most pig-like of the boys. "Who's she talking to out of the window? Let's tell the school inspector that she talks to people out of the window, and she should be teaching us." "Let's go and see who it is," said another boy, and they all came crowding to the window. But as soon as their mean little faces looked out, Bacchus gave a great cry of "Ooh-on, ooh-on, oi-oi-oi," and the boys began howling with fright and trampling one another to try to get out the door and jumping out of the windows. And it was said afterwards, whether truly or not, that those peculiar little boys were never seen again, but that there was a lot of very fine little pigs in that part of the country that had never been seen there before. "Now, dear heart," Aslan said to the schoolmistress as she jumped down and joined them. At Beaver's Dam, they recrossed the river and came east again along the southern bank. They came to a little cottage where a child stood in the doorway crying. "Why are you crying, my love?" said Aslan. The child, who had never seen a picture of a lion, wasn't afraid of him. "My auntie is very ill," he said, "and she's going to die." Then Aslan went to go in at the door of the cottage, but it was too small for him. So when he had got his head through, he pushed with his shoulders. Lucy and Susan fell off when he did this, and lifted the whole house up, and it fell backwards and fell apart. And there, still in her bed, though the bed was now in the open air, lay a little old woman who looked as if she had some dwarf blood in her. She was at death's door. But when she opened her eyes and saw the bright, hairy head of the lion, she didn't scream or faint. "Oh, Aslan, I knew it was true. I've been waiting for this all my life. Have you come to take me away?" "Yes, dearest," said Aslan, "but not for the long journey yet." And as he spoke, like the flush creeping along the underside of a cloud at sunrise, the color came back into her white face, and her eyes grew bright, and she said, "Well, I do believe I feel better, and I think I could take a little breakfast this morning." "Here you are, mother," said Bacchus, dipping a little pitcher in the cottage well and handing it to her. But what was in it was not water, but the richest wine, red as red currant jelly, smooth as oil, strong as beef, warming as tea, cool as dew. "Hey, you've done something to our well," said the old woman. "This makes a nice change." And she jumped out of bed. "Ride on me," said Aslan. And she added to Susan and Lucy, "You two queens will have to run now." "But we'd like that just as well," said Susan. And off they went again. And at last, with leaping and dancing and singing, with music and laughter and roaring and barking and neighing, they all came to the place where Miraz's army stood, flinging down their swords and holding up their hands. And Peter's army, still holding their weapons and breathing hard, stood around them with stern and glad faces. And the first thing that happened was that the old woman slipped off Aslan's back and ran across to Caspian. And they embraced one another, for she was his old nurse. Chapter 15. Aslan makes a door in the air. At the sight of Aslan, the cheeks of the Telmarines became the color of cold gravy. Their knees knocked together, and many fell on their faces. They had not believed in lions, and this made their fear even greater. Even the red dwarfs, who knew that he came as a friend, stood with open mouths and couldn't speak. Some of the black dwarfs, who had been of Nicobrick's party, began to edge away. But all the talking beasts surged around the lion with purrs and grunts and squeaks and whinnies of delight, fawning on him with their tails, rubbing against him, touching him reverently with their noses, going to and fro under his body and between his legs. If you have ever seen a little cat loving a big dog whom it knows and trusts, then you have a pretty good idea of their behavior. Then Peter, leading Caspian, forced his way through the crowd of animals. "This is Caspian, sir," he said, and Caspian knelt and kissed the lion's paw. "Welcome, Prince," said Aslan. "Do you feel yourself sufficient to take up the kingship of Narnia?" "I don't think I do, sir," said Caspian. "I'm only a kid." "Good," said Aslan. "If you had felt yourself sufficient, that would have been proof that you were not. Therefore, under us and under the High King, you shall be King of Narnia, Lord of Cair Paravel, and Emperor of the Lone Islands. You and your heirs while your race lasts, and your coronation, but what have we here?" For at that moment, a curious little procession was approaching. 11 mice, 6 of whom carried between them something on a litter made of branches, but the litter was no bigger than a big book. No one had ever seen mice more woebegone than these. They were plastered with mud, and their whiskers drooped, and their tails dragged in the grass, and their leader piped on his slender pipe a melancholy tune. And on the litter lay what seemed to be little better than a damp heap of fur, all that was left of Reepicheep. He was still breathing, but more dead than alive, gashed with innumerable wounds, one paw crushed, and where his tail had been, a bandaged stump. "Now, Lucy," said Aslan. Lucy had her diamond bottle out in a moment. Though only a drop was needed on each of Reepicheep's wounds, the wounds were so many that there was a long and anxious silence before they had finished, and the Master Mouse sprang from the litter. His hands went at once to his sword, but with the other hand he twirled his whiskers, and he bowed. "Hail, Aslan!" came his shrill voice. "I have the honor—" But he stopped suddenly. The fact was that he still had no tail, Whether Lucy had forgotten it or her cordial, though it could heal wounds, did not make things grow again. Reepicheep became aware of his loss as he made his bow. Perhaps it altered his balance somehow. He looked over his right shoulder, and failing to see his tail, he strained his neck further till he had to turn his shoulders and his whole body around. By that time, his hindquarters had turned too and were out of sight. Then he strained his neck looking over his other shoulder. Only after he had turned around completely 3 times did he realize the dreadful truth. "I am confounded," said Reepicheep to Aslan. "I am completely out of countenance. I must crave your indulgence for appearing in this most unseemly fashion." "But it becomes you very well, little one," said Aslan. "All the same," replied Reepicheep, "if anything could be done, perhaps your majesty—" And here he bowed to Lucy. "But why do you need a tail?" said Aslan. "Sir," said the mouse, "I can eat and sleep and die for my king without one. But a tail is the honor and glory of a mouse." "I have sometimes wondered, friend," said Aslan, "whether maybe you don't think too much about your honor." "Highest of all high kings," said Reepicheep, "permit me to remind you that a very small size has been bestowed on us mice, and if we did not guard our dignity, some, who weigh worth by inches, would allow themselves a very unsuitable jokes at our expense. That is why I have been at some pains to make it known that no one who does not wish to feel this sword should talk in my presence about traps or toasted cheese or candles. No, sir, not the tallest fool in Narnia." Here he glared up very fiercely at Wimbleweather. But the giant, who was always a step behind everyone else, had not yet discovered what was being talked about down at his feet, and he missed the point. "Why have your followers all drawn their swords, may I ask?" said Aslan. "May it please your high majesty," said the second mouse, whose name was Peepiseek, "we are all waiting to cut off our own tails. If the chief must go without his, we will not bear the shame of wearing an honor which is denied to the high mouse." "Ah," roared Aslan, "you have conquered me. You have great hearts, not for the sake of your dignity, Reepicheep, but for the love between you and your people, and still more, for the kindness that your people showed me long ago when you ate away the cords that bound me to the stone table. And then, though you have long forgotten it, you began to be talking mice. You shall have your tail again." Before Aslan had finished speaking, the new tail was in its place. Then, at Aslan's command, Peter bestowed the knighthood of the Order of the Lion on Caspian, and Caspian, as soon as he was knighted, himself bestowed it on Truffle Hunter and Trumpkin and Reepicheep, and made Dr. Cornelius his chief counselor, and confirmed the Bulgy Bear in his hereditary office of Marshal of the Lists, and there was great applause. After this, the Telmarine soldiers, firmly but without taunts or blows, were taken across the ford and all put under lock and key in the town of Baruna and given beef and beer. They all made a great fuss about wading across the river, for they all hated and feared running water, just as much as they hated and feared woods and animals. But in the end, the nuisance was over, and the nicest part of that long day began. Lucy, sitting close to Aslan and divinely comfortable, wondered what the trees were doing. At first she thought they were merely dancing. They were certainly going around in 2 circles very slowly, one from left to right and the other from right to left. Then she noticed that they kept throwing something down in the center of both circles. Sometimes she thought they were cutting off long strands of their hair. At other times it looked like they were breaking off bits of their fingers. But if so, they had plenty of fingers to spare, and it didn't hurt them. But whatever they were throwing down, when it reached the ground, it became brushwood or dry sticks. Then 3 or 4 of the red dwarfs came forward with their tinder boxes and set a light to this pile, which at first crackled and then blazed and finally roared, as the woodland bonfire on a midsummer night ought to do, and everyone sat down in a wide circle around it. Then Bacchus and Silenus and the Menaids began to dance, far wilder than the dance of the trees, not merely a dance for fun and beauty, though it was that too, but a magic dance of plenty. And wherever their hands touched and wherever their feet fell, the feast came into existence. Sides of roasted meat that filled the grove with delicious smells. Wheaten cakes and oaten cakes, honey and many-colored sugars and cream as thick as porridge and as smooth as still water, peaches, nectarines, pomegranates, pears, grapes, strawberries, raspberries, pyramids and cataracts of fruit. Then in great wooden bowls and cups, wreathed with ivy, came the wines, dark, thick ones like syrup of mulberry juice, and clear red ones like red jelly liquefied, and yellow wines and yellow-green and greenish-yellow wines. But for the tree people, different fare was provided. When Lucy saw Clodsley Shovel and his moles scuffling in the dirt in various places, which Bacchus had pointed out to them, and realized that the trees were going to eat earth, it gave her rather a shudder. Here's a picture of all the different foods that they were going to eat. All the fruit and those big bowls of the different kinds of wine, all the cakes and things. Looks delicious. But when she saw that the earths that they actually brought to them, she felt quite different, because they began with a rich brown loam that looked almost exactly like chocolate. So like chocolate, in fact, that Edmund tried a piece of it, but he didn't find it at all nice. When the rich loam had taken the edge off their hunger, the trees turned to an earth, the kind you see in Somerset, which is almost pink. They said it was lighter and sweeter. And after that, they had a cheese stage and had some chalky soil, and then went on to delicate confections of the finest gravels, with the choicest of silver sand. They drank very little wine, and it made the hollies very talkative. For the most part, they quenched their thirst with deep draughts of mingled dew and rain, flavored with forest flowers, and the airy taste of the thinnest of clouds. Thus Aslan feasted the Narnians till long after the sunset had died away, and the stars had come out, and the great fire, now hotter but less noisy, shone like a beacon in the dark woods, and the frightened Telmarines saw it from far away and wondered what it could mean. The best thing about all this feast was that there was no breaking up or going away, but as the talk grew quieter and slower, one after another began to nod and finally drop off to sleep with their feet toward the fire. And good friends on either side, until at last there was silence all around the circle, and the chattering of the water over the stone at the fords of Baruna could be heard again once more. But all night Aslan and the moon gazed at each other with joyful and unblinking eyes. The next day, messengers, who were chiefly squirrels and birds, were sent all over the country with a proclamation to the scattered Telmarines, including, of course, the prisoners at Baruna. They were told that Caspian was now the king, and that Narnia would henceforth belong to the talking beasts and the dwarfs and the dryads and the fauns and the other creatures as much as to any men. Any who chose to stay under those conditions might do so, but those who did not like the idea, Aslan would provide with another home. Anyone who wished to go there must come to Aslan and the king by the fords of Baruna by noon on the 5th day. You may imagine that this caused plenty of head-scratching among the Telmarines. Some of them, chiefly the young ones, had, like Caspian, heard stories of the old days and were delighted that they had come back. They were already making friends with the creatures, and they all decided to stay in Narnia. But most of the older men, especially those who had been important under Miraz, were sulky and had no wish to live in a country where they could not rule the roost. Live here with a lot of blooming performing animals? No fear, they said. And ghosts too, some added with a shudder. That's what those dryads really are. It's not right. And they were also suspicious. I don't trust them, they said. Not with that awful lion and all. He won't keep his claws off us for long. You'll see. But then they were equally suspicious of his offer to give them a new home. He'll take us off to his den, most likely, and eat us one by one. And the more they talked to one another, the sulkier and more suspicious they became. But on the appointed day, more than half of them turned up. At one end of the glade, Aslan had caused to be set up 2 stakes of wood, higher than a man's head and about 3 feet apart. A third and lighter piece of wood was tied across them at the top, uniting them, so the whole thing looked like a doorway from nowhere to nowhere. In front of this stood Aslan himself, with Peter on his right and Caspian on his left. And grouped around them were Susan and Lucy, Trumpkin and Trufflehunter, the Lord Cornelius, Glenstorm, Reepicheep, and others. The children and the dwarfs had made good use of the royal wardrobes in what had been the castle of Miraz, and now the castle of Caspian, of course, and what with silk and cloth of gold, with snowy linen glancing through slashed sleeves, with chainmail shirts and jeweled sword hilts and helmets and feathered bonnets, they were almost too bright to look at. Even the beasts wore rich chains around their necks. But nobody's eyes were on them or the children. The living and strokable mane of Aslan outshone them all. The rest of the old Narnians stood down in each side of the glade, and at the far end stood the Telmarines. The sun shone brightly, and pennants fluttered in the wind. "Men of Telmar," said Aslan, "you who seek a new land, hear my words. I will send you all to your own country, which I know, though you do not." "We don't remember Telmar. We don't know where it is. We don't know what it's like," grumbled the Telmarines. "You came into Narnia out of Telmar," said Aslan, "but you came into Telmar from another place. You do not belong in this world at all. You came here certain generations ago out of that same world to which the High King Peter belongs." At this, half the Telmarines began whimpering. "There you are. See, I told you so. He's going to kill us all and send us right out of this world." And the other half began throwing out their chests and slapping one another on the back and whispering, "There you are. We might have known we didn't belong to this place with its queer, unnatural creatures. We're of royal blood, you'll see." And even Caspian and Cornelius and the children turned to Aslan with amazement on their faces. "Peace," said Aslan in the low voice which was nearest to his growl, and the whole earth seemed to shake a little, and every living thing in the grove became still as stone. "You, Sir Caspian," said Aslan, "might have known that there could be no true king of Narnia unless, like the kings of old, you were a son of Adam and came from the world of Adam's sons, and so you are. Many years ago in that world, in a deep sea of that world, which is called the South Sea, a shipload of pirates was driven by a storm onto an island. And there they did as pirates would. They killed the natives, and they took the native women for their wives, and they made palm wine, and they drank, and they were drunk, and they laid in the shade of the palm trees, and they woke up and quarreled, and sometimes killed one another. And in one of these frays, 6 of them were put to flight by the rest and fled with their women up to the center of the island, up onto a mountainside, and they went, as they thought, into a cave to hide. But it was one of the magical places of that world, one of the chinks or chasms between that world and this one. There were many of them between the worlds in the old times, but they have grown rarer. This was one of the last, but I don't say the last. And so they fell or rose or blundered or dropped right through and found themselves in this world, in the land of Telmar, which at that time was unpeopled. But why it was unpeopled is a long story, and I won't tell it now. And in Telmar, their descendants lived and became a fierce and proud people, and after many generations, there was a famine in Telmar, and they invaded Narnia, which was then in some disorder, but that also would be a long story. And they conquered it and ruled it. Do you mark all this well, King Caspian? I do indeed, sir, said Caspian. I was wishing that I came of a more honorable lineage. You come from Lord Adam and the Lady Eve, said Aslan, and that is both honor and honor enough to lift the head of the poorest beggar and shame enough to bow the shoulders of the greatest emperor on earth, so be content. Caspian bowed. And now, said Aslan, you men and women of Telmar, will you go back to the island in the world of men from which your fathers came? It is no bad place. The race of those pirates who first found it has died out, and there are no inhabitants there now. There are good wells of fresh water, fruitful soil, timber for building, fish in the lagoons, and other men of that world have not yet discovered it. The chasm is open for your return, but I must warn you that once you have gone through, it will close again, behind you forever. There will be no more commerce between those worlds by that door again. There was silence for a moment. Then a burly, decent-looking fellow among the Telmarine soldiers pushed forward and said, well, I'll take the offer. It is well chosen, said Aslan, and because you have spoken first, strong magic is upon you. Your future in that world shall be good. Come forth. The man, now a little pale, came forward. Aslan and his court drew aside, leaving him free access to the empty doorway of stakes. Go through it, my son, said Aslan, bending toward him and touching the man's nose with his own. And as soon as the lion's breath came about him, a new look came into the man's eyes, startled but not unhappy, as if he was trying to remember something. Then he squared his shoulders and walked through the door. Everyone's eyes were fixed on him. They saw the 3 pieces of wood, and through them the trees and grass and sky of Narnia. Then they saw the man between the doorposts, but in 1 second he vanished entirely. From the other end of the glade, the remaining Telmarines started wailing. Oh, what has happened to him? What do you mean, to murder us? We won't go that way. And then one of the clever Telmarines said, we don't see any other world through those sticks. If you want to believe in it, why doesn't one of you go? All of your own friends are keeping well away from the sticks. Here's a picture of the Telmarine going through the doorway of sticks. Instantly, Reepicheep stood forward and bowed and said, if my example can be of any service, Aslan, I will take 11 mice through that arch of your bidding without a moment's delay. Nay, little one, said Aslan, laying his velvety paw ever so lightly on Reepicheep's head. They would do dreadful things to you in that world. They would show you at fairs. It is to others who must lead. Come on, said Peter suddenly to Edmund and Lucy. Our time's up. What do you mean, said Edmund. This way, said Susan, who seemed to know all about it. Back into the trees. We've got to change. Change what? Said Lucy. Our clothes, of course, said Susan. Nice fools we'd look on the platform of an English train station in these. But our other things are at Caspian's castle, said Edmund. No, they're not, said Peter, still leading the way into the thickest wood. They're all here. They were brought down in bundles this morning. It's all arranged. Was that what Aslan was talking to you about? And you and Susan this morning, said Lucy. Yes, that and other things, said Peter, his face very solemn. I can't tell it to you all now. There are some things he wanted to say to Sue and me because we are not coming back to Narnia. Never? Said Edmund and Lucy in dismay. Oh, you two are, said Peter. At least from what he said, I'm pretty sure he means that you two will come back someday, but not Sue and me. He says we're getting too old. Oh, Peter, said Lucy, what awful bad luck. Can you bear it? Well, I think I can, said Peter. It's all rather different from what I thought. You'll understand when it comes to be your last time, but quick, here are our things. It was odd and not very nice to take off their royal clothes and come back to their school uniforms, not very fresh now, into that great assembly. 1 or 2 of the nastier Telmarines jeered at them. But the other creatures all cheered and rose up in honor of Peter the High King and Queen Susan of the Horn and King Edmund and Queen Lucy. There were affectionate, and on Lucy's part, tearful farewells with all their old friends Animal kisses and hugs from the bulgy bears, hands wrung by Trumpkin, and a last tickly, whiskerish embrace with Truffle Hunter. And of course, Caspian offered the horn back to Susan, and of course, Susan told him to keep it. And then, wonderfully and terribly, it was goodbye to Aslan himself. And Peter took his place with Susan's hands on his shoulders, and Edmund's hands on hers, and Lucy's on his, and the first of the Telmarines on Lucy's, and so, in a long line, they moved toward the door. After that came a moment which is hard to describe, for the children seemed to be seeing three things at once. One was the mouth of a cave opening into the glaring green and blue of an island in the Pacific, where all the Telmarines would find themselves the minute they went through the door. The second was the glade in Narnia, and the faces of the dwarfs and the beasts and the deep eyes of Aslan. But the third, which rapidly swallowed up the other two, was the gray, gravelly surface of a platform in a country train station, and a seat with their luggage all around it, where they were all sitting as if they had never moved from it. A little flat and dreary for the moment after they had all been through, but also unexpectedly nice in its own way, what with the familiar railway smell and the English sky and the summer term before them. Well, said Peter, we have had a time. Oh, bother, said Edmund. I left my new flashlight in Narnia. Here are the children on the platform there at the train station with their luggage all around them. And that's goodbye to the four children for this time, for that's the end of the book of Prince Caspian. Isn't that a wonderful story? I'm so glad we could be together to read that. Next time, we're going to start a new one, and it's called The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Ooh, it's one of my very favorites. It's got some scary parts in it, but I think you'll like it a lot. Please come back, and we'll start that again tomorrow. Meanwhile, bye for now.